Dark Souls 2 might not be as well acclaimed as its predecessor, but it still holds a special place in my heart. If we include the DLCs, the sequel has almost twice the boss fights as the original, and with this increase, most would agree that many encounters are less polished and memorable than in Dark Souls 1. However, it would be unfair to ignore that there are plenty of new ideas thrown into the mix and creative little touches that actually make the game more enjoyable in my personal opinion. The first thing you will notice when you run the game is that the player's movement speed is significantly slower, and so are many actions, like rolling and healing. This also extends to enemies and bosses. Furthermore, some actions, like rolling, consume significantly more stamina, making you only able to dodge 3 or 4 times in succession when you start off. On top of all that, we have the infamous adaptability stat, which by proxy increases how many invincibility frames you get when dodging. A starting character can have iframe values of as little as 1/3 of the highest potential amount in Dark Souls 1, which makes dodging an extremely ineffective move early game. These factors combined make the game feel more strategic and deliberate. Stamina management is more key than ever, and this means that it's the decisions you make which will determine your success, rather than mechanical skill. I think the biggest step up in terms of quality is just that the AI freezes less. It is a problem in all Dark Souls games that the AI will sometimes just stop for many seconds before doing anything. This happens the most in the first game and less as time went on. This is pretty important, because these occurrences make the fight feel less like a scrap for survival and more like wailing on some big fat fuck too lazy to even attack me when I'm trying to kill him. Dark Souls 2 has a reputation of having some really bad boss runbacks, and I don't really agree with this. Yes, the co-op areas are absolutely terrible, but I don't find the other runbacks to be any worse than in the previous game. Anyway, the reason why I'm bringing this up is to highlight that I am not judging runbacks as part of the boss fight, so they do not impact the placements on the tier list. Also, I forgot to mention that a boss's position within a tier is also ranked, so a boss on the right side of the row is one I like less than the one on the left side. One last thing before we begin, I will be making comparisons to bosses from Dark Souls 1, so make sure to go and watch that video if you haven't. The boss lineup in Dark Souls 2 is less polished, but significantly more varied and creative than its predecessor. So we've got bangers interlaced with incredibly dull fights. I wouldn't say there's all that many fights that are frustrating in the bad way. Most of them are just kind of boring and pretty easy, and no other fight exemplifies this better than potentially the first. Dark Souls 2 starts off a lot more open-ended than its predecessor, and this means there are a few different boss fights which might potentially be your first. However, the last giant is in an area most clearly supposed to be tackled first, since the enemies on the other path are significantly stronger. And if this is supposed to be the tutorial boss, it misses the mark completely. The giant can only stomp or slap you. Both of these types of attacks are really easy to avoid. Literally, the only interesting thing that happens in the fight is that halfway through, he tears off his arm to get a little more reach on his slaps. With a bow or magic, you can actually shoot it off before the phase transition. However, I literally have nothing else to say. The giant will stomp or slap. You walk around those attacks, the boss dies. That's it. This fight is not frustrating, but it's more boring than anything in the original game. This guy is widely regarded to be a bit of a pushover, and if you've come right off the back of a boss like Artorias, I could see that. However, Dark Souls 2 was the first Dark Souls game I played, so while he isn't as fast or aggressive as the Abyss Walker, he gave me a ton of trouble on my first playthrough. His variety of sword combos and individual swipes isn't all that impressive, but the animations are intuitive and smooth. Many of his attacks have some sort of movement or gap close to them, giving the fight some personality. Furthermore, there's actually several different twists. Firstly, many swordsman bosses in Dark Souls 2 can be parried. This is a change from the original, where only Gwyn could be. I think this is a good change. Parrying is a bit more challenging in this game, because the parry frames don't come out as soon as you press the button. Therefore, parrying might be a bit more satisfying now. I think parryable bosses increase the build variety and the player's overall options in the game. However, many bosses cannot be reposted, which is a bit of a weird choice. Still, you get a large opening for damage when you land a successful parry. The Pursuer's rapid forward charge attack is especially satisfying to counter, in my experience. Next up, there is a powered phase, but this isn't activated by the boss dropping on a health. Instead, he's got a grab attack, where he makes the sword glow blue and will skewer you with it. This curses your character, dropping your max health, but it also empowers the boss, giving him new ranged homing dark orb attacks. His helmet visor will glow red to signalize this powered state. Thirdly, there are two different, absurdly powerful ballistas in this arena. They will break from any attack, but they give you an opportunity to kill the boss unlike any other. You can use them by walking up to them and pressing interact to mount the weapon and pressing the button again to fire. The rate of fire is abysmal, and you cannot aim them, but if the entire shot hits the mark, it will take off more than half the boss's health bar. This works especially well in co-op, when you have a friend to lock the boss into the right position. Just be careful not to hit your ally, because this damages friendly characters too. You can actually face him way earlier than in his arena. He will drop down onto this rooftop, and it doesn't count as a boss fight. You have one chance to kill him, and if you fail, he will not come here anymore, and will wait in his boss arena. You get all the rewards, and his arena will be empty if you succeed initially. This enemy will appear several more times as a non-boss enemy in the Lost Bastille and a few other areas, but for some reason he will start out in his empowered state. The boss enemy Alonne is kind of basic, but he works very well, and the few twists really add a lot of spice to the fight. I still find him pretty challenging, even after numerous playthroughs. Therefore, the Pursuer is one of my personal highlights of the game. Fans of the original Dark Souls might catch this little reference. It's Ornstein again, but he's alone this time, and he's got some new moves to show for it. This might not actually be Ornstein as the character, but that's how I will be referring to him. Regardless, he's doing a pretty shit job at dragon slaying, since there is one right outside his boss room that we must kill to get inside the cathedral. The arena's shape and layout is pretty similar to the original fight, even including the pillars. However, there's not all that much use for them, since there is no need for separating any aggro. Ornstein's speed is comparable to that of the Pursuer, and his melee attacks are all quite varied and are pretty smooth and satisfying to dodge. He's inherited Smo's butt slam, but it deals dark damage for some reason. There's not all that much to say here. Ornstein is pretty much what you would expect, and there's no gimmick. Pretty fun fight, but I gotta dock him some points for the rehash. This boss is standing around in his small circular arena, and you can see that before you ever reach him. There is a bit of a gimmick here. As you're traversing the Heights Tower of Flame Zone, clearing out two areas of enemies will reveal two levers. Pulling each of those will raise up an additional ring of surface area in the arena, extending its size. Pretty cool idea, but some bright spark at the dev team decided that harming the boss from outside his arena should be possible. So the most risk-free tactic is to stock up on arrows and shoot the fucker for many minutes straight. You can't kill him, he will put up his shield and hide eventually. When you enter the arena, he will have 1 health, So, massive minus points on that, because the game shouldn't encourage boring gameplay. Now, this guy is really just a person with a weapon. He's got about 3 or 4 moves, and that's it. They're pretty smooth and are telegraphed well, but it's a boring and easy fight, even without the additional surface area. This boss doesn't have a moveset where range affects the fight much, so the raised rings don't help a lot. In fact, if you refuse to pull the levers, you can get the boss to step off the edge and die instantly. It's nice that you have a reason to not raise the rings, but once you know the cheese, there's no functional reason not to always do it this way. I don't usually go for it, because I want to have at least a semblance of a challenge. This is a pretty boring and inoffensive fight, but the 2 cheese methods really sour my opinion, so he's gonna be pretty low down. This is a pretty atmospheric and a little climactic fight. The entire pirate-themed area of No Man's Wharf has been building up to this. You've traversed the zone to ring a bell that calls in a massive ghost ship, and then had to go back down around to board it. In the underbelly, you find this monstrosity that seems to be 2 humanoids grafted onto each other by their backs. The main gimmick here is that each side has different weapons and different movesets, so you must either deal with an enemy that occasionally switches their behavior, or try to stay on the one side you like better. One side is dual wielding 2 maces, and the other has 2 curved swords. Unfortunately, the side wielding maces is widely agreed to be the easiest to avoid, and it's also pretty easy to just walk around and stay on this side if you need to. The moveset for each side is nothing special, but they're functional. The sword side has significantly faster and more oppressive attacks, so the mace side is probably where you want to stay. This side has a pretty basic attacks too, and there is not much to comment on here. There is one curveball move from the mace side, where the other half will reach over the boss and stab you with the swords. The other gimmick is that the bottom of the ship is filled with water, and its level will rise as time goes on in the fight. This will slow down your movement ever more, encouraging you to kill the boss quickly. The 2 gimmicks here are pretty novel, and the moveset is fine for what it is, but not terribly diverse or exciting. Still, I always enjoy this fight when I get around to it. This boss is a pretty hefty roadblock for new players, but for me, I see one of the better fights of the game. When entering the boss room, you will drop down onto a small platform with 1 ruined sentinel. The moveset initially is pretty small, but it's smooth and got a lot of personality as far as I'm concerned. We haven't really seen any enemies so far, with these weird weapons which look like golf clubs. Unfortunately, there is no way to obtain these for ourselves. There is a lower arena that you can drop down onto, and 1 other larger elevated platform. As some time passes, 2 more ruined sentinels will come from the second area. If you've stayed on the initial landing spot, they will have to jump down and then jump up again to reach you. You can exploit this setup by killing the first sentinel quickly, then waiting on the platform for the second one to reach you. This way you can separate all 3 and fight each one individually. If you get knocked off the platform, you might have to face several enemies at once. In this space, their moveset gets a little expanded. They can now throw their shield in a ranged attack, or do this weird spin. This move is actually too powerful for my taste, and really hard to avoid. If the sentinel initiates it when you're up close, I personally have no plan to effectively avoid all the strikes. So this move seems unfair to me. Facing all 3 at once is not impossible, but it will require a lot of patience to suss out a proper opening. The fight can go many different ways pretty quickly if you fail to kill the first sentinel in time or get knocked off. There might be anywhere between 1 and 3 enemies to fight at once. If you want to get back up, there are a few illusory walls which can take you there. However, I have never tried using this in the actual fight, as it's a bit too hectic for me. I also wanted to shout out probably the most creative shortcut in the series. It doesn't factor into the overall grade, like mentioned previously, but every time I bring it up, someone says they never knew about this, so here it goes. In the tower leading up to the fight, you've probably opened this door that just seems to lead to a lethal drop. This isn't just a Dark Souls troll moment though. You can now use this doorway to drop down from an elevated platform back from outside. Just sprint off without rolling or jumping. This is one of my favorite shortcuts in the series. So to summarize, I really like this fight. They've successfully managed to combine an engaging DPS race, gank, and puzzle boss into one, just by manipulating the terrain of the arena. Staying on the initial platform is harder than it might seem, so you will probably have to engage multiple ruined Sentinels at some point in your Dark Souls 2 playthroughs. Here's another weird rehash. This boss fight consists of 5 gargoyles breaking off and coming alive on individual timers. These gargoyle enemies are extremely similar to those from Dark Souls 1. However, this fight does not have the same taste and deliberation as the original. I've never had the battle go so poorly that I had to fight all 5 at the same time, but having 3 or 4 active at once is pretty normal. The problem, of course, is that these enemies were designed to be fought as a duo at most, with one gargoyle mostly attacking from a distance, and one engaging in exchanges of sharp objects at high enough energies to harm a person. So, the fight is just overwhelming, honestly, and pretty frustrating. There is no real way to cleanly fight them all at once. It's just a big clusterfuck. I don't know if I need to say anymore. We've got a rehash that manages to be mechanically worse than the original. Pretty frustrating fight. Much like in Dark Souls 1, we're gonna have to kill 4 Lord Soul bosses to progress. However, this is our first goal in the sequel, and then the game becomes more linear after that. This is probably the first of the big 4 that you will come across. In the opening cutscene, you will notice that there is a small chaos bug controlling the humanoid, the same one from the Bed of Fucking Chaos. So, this character is the inheritor of the Chaos Soul. Fortunately, this fight has absolutely nothing to do with its predecessor, and is instead a pretty standard swordsman fight. The battle takes place in a really dark rectangular arena. This darkness actually reduces the lock-on range, which has some effect on the fight. You can counter this by using a torch to light up 2 nodes of oil from outside the arena. The runback arguably has some impact on the fight, since you're either gonna have to use a flame butterfly to light the torch once you've reached those nodes, or run all the way with it from the bonfire. A big part of the area is flooded, so rolling will extinguish the torch. This idea is pretty cool, but flame butterflies are way too common to be an issue to just light the oil on the spot. Doing so will brighten up the arena and restore your normal lock-on capabilities. You could also fight with a torch in hand, but I've never tried this. The Lost Sinner is pretty fast and aggressive for what we've seen so far, and she's got some variety to her attacks. Most people agree that it's a woman, but how they know this is beyond me. The moves are quite different to anything else we've seen in this game, especially this weird charge stab. She can also jump around for a surprise attack from behind. This is where your lock-on will be broken off if the arena is dark, adding some difficulty to the fight. This battle is pretty nifty mechanically, but it's not varied enough for my taste to truly stand out. It's solid, but not all that exciting for me, and the fight just feels like a slightly different swordsman battle that isn't as exciting or visually intimidating as the Pursuer. Here's a pretty gimmicky and memorable boss, even if the fight is not that intense. The arena is basically a NASCAR oval, with a big hole in the ground. The boss is a horse-like creature that will run around in circles, dragging a spiked chariot around. The enemy can clear the gap, but not you. Around the arena are several skeletons that will get run over by the chariot, but they will aggro onto you. These skeletons will actually get resurrected, by 2 necromancers in the arena. The chariot covers the entire width of the track, but you can actually roll under the spikes on the wheels. Still, you're probably going to want to take cover inside of those alcoves instead. The chariot is running around at pretty high speeds, so hitting it is basically impossible at this stage. We need to find a way to stop them. You must make your way around the oval, taking cover when the chariot is about to run you over and fight off the skeletons. Kill the necromancers to stop the resurrections, and you've made the fight a lot easier, though this is technically not required to beat the boss. Once you've made it around 2/3 of the way around, you can pull a lever which will lower a gate across the track. The horse will crash through and the chariot gets destroyed for some reason, even though the horse was up first. Anyway, the monster is now incapable of running around, so you can fight them head on. The horse enemy itself is pretty basic, there isn't all that much exciting or novel about the fight. It's got some basic headbutts, charges, kicks, etc. The monster seems fine though, so I don't know why it won't just resume running around. Still, I think people undersell how tough this fight can be. I usually die once or twice on my playthroughs. Not because of the horse, but because of the gauntlet leading up. The alcoves are pretty tight, so if you miss time getting inside, you might get stuck on some skeletons, and your weapon will recoil off the wall. There is a cheese method where you use arrows in the initial phase to wear down the horse. Poison arrows work the best. Once the boss gets wounded enough, the horse will actually fail to clear the jump and get stuck hanging onto the ledge, and then you can walk up and finish them off. This cheese is quite boring, but it's still pretty vital to go the distance and kill both necromancers. The reward for beating the boss is nothing special if you're not into multiplayer, because it's access to an invasion and PvP based covenant. So, I actually think this boss ticks all the boxes for a gimmick fight. I find the boss to be way harder than many people make it out to be, so it's not boring for me. Still, a novel and pretty polished distraction. You might notice that so far, quite a few of the bosses had some gimmicks and creative twists to them. This sort of effort and ingenuity is what I really appreciate about Dark Souls 2, and I think this adds a lot of spice and personality to the game. Another heavy gank boss. Are we starting to see a pattern yet? Initiating the encounter, we have the 3 different big lords coming to fight us. They're not very strong, but they do have some variance to them, as each is almost like a different class. They wield a halberd, a scythe, and pyromancies respectively. Anyway, once you kill one and further lords, we will start getting swarms of regular skeletons appearing in the arena, and killing them ticks down the boss health bar further. You cannot win by just killing the 3 lords. This fight is pretty easy, and a bit lazy when it comes to the swarm part. I appreciate that they designed the 3 lords as unique enemies, but I think it says something that they die so fast that I cannot describe their movesets with any particularities. Furthermore, the horde mode is a bit of a shitfest. It's almost impossible to not be trading damage as a melee character. Plus, it is just a lot of regular enemies, put together masquerading as a real boss fight. I really hope we won't have to see that again. Right? So, to sum up, not a big fan, but the fight is easy enough not to get frustrating, and I appreciate that there's actually 3 new enemies in there. This guy certainly is one of... Okay, I've done this joke before, you know what's up. So, this guy is a big slug. Yeah. I don't know what else I can say. He is really easy. Like, I purposefully tried to extend the fight just to get more footage, and I still accidentally killed him. He is slow. He is pretty defenseless on his sides. and if you sneeze on him, he dies. The forward-facing lunge attacks are not telegraphed well, and they feel like a roulette on if you manage to dodge them. The only unique things about this fight is that you can break open the big jars over the arena using a bow. This will release a hollow, and the demon will actually get distracted and try to eat him, if you somehow needed help. The other thing is that he has a grab attack, where he tries to eat you, and this attack unequips all gear you had on you, making you fumble around in your inventory to get it back. However, I've gotta say, I've played the game literally countless times, and I've never seen it in person. Plus, playing around in your inventory is a pretty janky thing to be doing in the middle of a fight, so I don't like it when I have to. Anyway, that's about all I can say on this guy. On to the next one. I had already written the review for this part before I recorded gameplay, thinking I already knew everything about this boss. However, something unprecedented happened. This enemy is a serpentine lady with a spear-type weapon. Her head is severed for some reason, and she's holding it in her other hand. The arena starts full of poison, and this poison heals her and, well, poisons you. So what do we do about this situation? Obviously, we go 2 bonfires back, take a torch, and set the windmill on fire. You fucking idiot! This will drain most of the poison from the arena. I found this out on my first playthrough due to a message on the ground, but I didn't know what effect this could have. I only learned of this after I've completed the game once, so since then I've been doing this every time, because I heard the fight is almost impossible otherwise. And that was a mistake. I wanted to grab some footage of her fight in the original form, and honestly, it was surprisingly manageable. The healing is very slight, the biggest problem is the poison on you, and having to find openings both between attacks, but also in time to heal, adds such a unique dimension to the fight. I was doing way more damage than she could restore, but it still kept me on my toes. The boss enemy itself isn't extremely interesting. She's got a small variety of stabs and sweeps with her polearm, and some magic attacks too. She can launch soul spears from her head, which screams when she does so for a pretty stark auditory telegraph. My favorite attack is where she throws her head on the ground, and then it explodes like a grenade, and she leaps down to retrieve it. This might be the funniest attack in the series. So anyway, if you think you're a master of the game, I highly recommend trying to fight this boss without draining the poison. It's a surprisingly challenging twist on a fight I knew inside and out, and it gave me a whole new appreciation for this boss. I really enjoy this encounter now. So, honestly, this boss is a pretty generic swordsman. Many people really love this fight, but I don't really see it. His attacks are pretty smooth, but there isn't a whole lot of them. The only move that I really think is cool is where he jumps up and pounds the ground. He will stay in this position for a pretty long time, but don't be fooled into thinking this is a punish window. If you end up too close to him in this state, he will do a massively delayed AoE explosion. The rest of his moveset is pretty standard, with some sweeps and thrusts changing things up. There are technically 3 phases to this fight. He will buff himself with an aura that deals slow chip damage when you're near him when a damage threshold is reached. Next, he will buff his sword with fire. Now, the aura does force you to slowly take damage if you're a melee character. Thankfully, this guy is really weak to poison, so using throwing knives might be enough for you to kill him if you really don't want to take the damage. This is also the point in the game where you will start to really struggle if you've neglected to level ADP to an appropriate level. Usually by this point I have all the iframes I was planning on getting, but not on my first playthrough, because I didn't know how ADP worked. This guy will really screw you up if you don't have them. Also, I don't really remember this happening in earlier playthroughs, but this time around, the demon's movements really screwed with my camera a few times. Don't really know what was happening here. So yeah, a pretty generic fight as far as I'm concerned. Don't really see why people like it so much. It's a perfectly serviceable boss though. I don't really have all that much to say about this boss fight. She looks like she's trying to be Quelaag, but with barely any of the charm. The scorpion part of the body can attack using the small claws or the big venomous tail. The human body has one spear attack that I can remember, but it can also cast ranged magic in the form of soul masses or soul spears. None of them are all that exciting or fun. Despite having a pretty wide range of moves, it somehow always lands on doing one of the tail or pincer attacks. She also has a move where she burrows underground. She will then move around for a bit, and you can see puffs of dust where she currently is. These puffs show up with just enough interval that you might get caught off on where she is. When she decides she's had enough playing Earthworm Jim, she will try to track onto you and jump out, dealing damage. For how many times I fought her, it's insane that I still don't know how to avoid this attack. There is no telegraph to speak of, because she is invisible, and the puffs of dust come out too rarely to be a precise indication of where she is. Plus, sometimes she surfaces, even without going under me. This move is frustrating, especially since it's scripted to always take many seconds. She won't just home in straight on you, she needs to spend some time underground. The coolest thing about the fight is that you can summon Man Scorpion Tark to help. This might be the first time in the series we can summon an NPC that isn't just a human character, and it can be pretty funny seeing this lumbering chimera duking it out with his girlfriend. This isn't going to count towards the fight, since I've established in the previous video that summons are not a substitute for game design, but I honestly need something good to say about this boss. So, that's it. A pretty forgettable and mediocre fight with nothing going for it. Let's move on. And the award for most derivative visual design goes to... This is the second of the big four that we must slay. You would only know this guy has the soul of Gwen if you read item descriptions, because otherwise there is absolutely nothing to give it away. When you initially enter the arena, he will slowly approach you from the lava. This is a bit different if you come to retry, because he will emerge from the lava just next to the walkable space. Now, we've got to talk about the arena, because it's pretty bloody tiny. Some of the edges are safely covered off by crumbled walls, but a lot of it is exposed to lava, so one misstep will spell your demise. And how about the most devilishly placed hole in the entire series? We've got it all. The boss enemy is pretty unexciting to fight. He will usually alternate between some arm slams and combos and some magic fire abilities like breathing fire, a laser from his hand, yada yada. This fight suffers from the if you wouldn't be doing anything, you'd be invincible syndrome. The boss feels like he's completely unintelligent or possibly suicidal, because if he's fighting an honorable knight, all he needs to do to stay alive is to just step away from the platform. And honestly, I don't blame him, because if I was a part of this game, I'd probably want to kill myself too. That was the one obligatory Dark Souls 2 bad joke. This does not reflect my actual position on the game. I love it very much. Yeah, so, moving on, the hole is probably your biggest problem in this fight, because the boss is really slow and easy to punish. Hiding behind the corner is almost perfectly safe too. His fire laser can penetrate the surface sometimes, but more crucially, the boss will eventually relocate and resurface on the other side of the platform. However, it takes ages for this to happen, giving you enough time to heal, buff, take a shower, walk your dog, get married, live a happy and fulfilling life, and die with a smile on your face, knowing you're not playing Dark Souls 2. Oh, what was that? We were playing Dark Souls 2. Okay. Kinda forgot that we're fighting a boss here. I might not be the sharpest tool in the shed, but you cannot convince me that this fucking thing is a rat. This fight is a bit of a shitfest. When you enter the big cavern, there will be 4 or so little rats that will charge you as soon as you do anything. These little fuckers inflict both petrification and toxic buildup, and the latter is so high that getting bit twice will probably be enough to intoxicate you. And when this happens, I wish to get intoxicated in real life, because this status effect is some royal shag. Why does it have to be this powerful? Why does there have to be 4 small and fast enemies inflicting this? And who thought this was a good idea? The boss enemy itself is really dog water to fight. It has its fair share of weirdly telegraphed head swipes, charges, stomps, and arm sweeps. However, all of the animations look really janky and unpolished. This thing does not move like a living creature, but more like a tank on weirdly stiff legs of paper mache. Most of the attacks feel really unintuitive to dodge. I don't think my description or the video can really do justice as to how unpolished this thing is to fight, so how about we just lock this guy in the cellar and move on. This fight is a pretty unique one. There are actually many enemies that make up the boss health bars. The congregation consists of many crawling and waddling hollows, plus these 2 clerics. The Prowling Magus is the guy in black with the big staff. Apparently, the name for this type of enemy is Aldia Warlock, but I'm not sure where this comes from. When it comes to the hollows, they are slow and don't do much damage, but there is enough of them to feel like a big biomass that might swallow you up if you're not careful. The 2 clerics are actually pretty important to the flow of this fight, because they can cast an AoE heal miracle that will restore the health of any enemies in their vicinity, and they will try to heal their big daddy if he gets wounded. Less importantly, they can cast lightning bolts as ranged attacks. Speaking of the Magus himself, he is a unique enemy, but doesn't pose much threat. He's got some ranged Dark Orb spells and a small AoE. All things considered, this isn't exactly your meticulously crafted Artorias boss or the like, because the variety of attacks you must avoid in this fight is pretty limited. Plus all the enemies here are easily staggerable, and even between all of them combined, they don't have much health. I can't put it all that high, but I quite enjoy the novelty, and the dynamic is a pretty unique one. The atmosphere here is really sweet as well. We've descended down into a tunnel infested with spiders, and we've opened a chest spiked with a red-eye trap, which wakes up and lures the spiders towards us. Before we enter the arena, we can hear the same creepy sounds that those egg bearers from Dark Souls 1 were making. The arena itself is a small, church-like, dimly lit underground room. All of these factors combined make it feel like we're intruding on some dark sermon, and the Prowling Magus is some traveling warlock with their own twisted agenda trying to swindle the local population. So to summarize, the fight is pretty novel, if easy. Still, I find it quite enjoyable, and I look forward to it on every playthrough. Here's another pretty passive and easy boss with a slight gimmick. Are we starting to see a pattern? So, this boss is a gargantuan spider. Freja has chitinous plating on most of her body, making her invulnerable to damage if struck in those places. The only spots we can attack to kill her are her 2 heads on each side of the torso. As mentioned earlier, she's not all that aggressive and is pretty slow. Most of her attacks consist of either impaling you with her legs or otherwise physically bludgeoning you. She can also spray some ranged balls of either acid or spider silk. Getting hit by the latter will actually slow you down and make you unable to roll for a substantial period of time. The last main attack is a sweeping magic laser. This attack takes a long time to perform, and it basically forces you to run to her other side if you want to punish her, because the head in front of you is the one doing the attacking. And despite wasting so much of her time, she unfortunately really likes doing it. The gimmick here reminds me a bit of the Flexile Sentry, however it's kind of inverted this time. There is no difference in moveset between the two sides, and many attacks only perform any action with the one side facing towards you. Therefore, you are actually encouraged to run around her and swap sides. Unfortunately, she is so big that this time spent running around really adds up. The only move that really feels bullshit to me is this weird, spastic, fuck everything in my general vicinity attack, which consists of both unpredictable and numerous slams with her legs, but also both unpredictable and numerous spits of ranged acid balls. The individual spits or slams don't have much telegraph, so to avoid this move you just have to run away and wait until she's done. There are a few small spiders in the arena too, but they're too slow and don't deal enough damage to be of any consequence. Also, there is a potential softlock with this boss. Dealing enough damage to one head will cut it off, meaning you now can only deal damage to the one remaining head. Normally, the boss will die before the second head can detach. However, if someone uses the Warmth Pyromancy to heal the boss, you will eventually cut off both heads and she will remain alive, making this boss unkillable. This is a big no-no from me. In the end, this boss is kind of gimmicky and simple. I don't hate it, and the jank doesn't make for a frustrating experience, but it's not exactly enjoyable or polished either. Also, for some reason, this boss specifically does not possess the third of the Great Souls. Instead, once we kill her, we must interact with this red orb to obtain it. I've heard the reasoning that it's the big dragon in the arena that has Seath's soul, for some reason, and that Freja was just defending her home, but I'm not sure how real this is.
I'm going to handcraft a polished and challenging foe to give players an epic duel. They will test the player's proficiency in many different elements of the gameplay. I will also create visual effects and a banging music track to get gamers and fights to remember.
This fella is the final of the 4 Lord Soul bosses. It's a big mess made of human bodies that melded together so hard they are now all the sus imposter among them. The fight plays out in pretty much the same way as most big swordsmen of this game. He's got some fairly standard swipes and combos with his big cleaver, and some ranged orbs, plus an AoE for good measure. These attacks are nothing spectacular nor interesting. However, I personally find the melee attacks really well telegraphed and very intuitive to dodge. I don't know what it is about them, but they are so much easier for me to avoid without practice than other swordsmen. His health pool is pretty small, which doesn't make for a challenging fight, but at least the battle doesn't drag on, as I'm sure it would have with his limited moveset had his health been higher. The Rotten is not very aggressive, and he is too slow to make an impression even on newcomers to the game. The best thing I've got to say about this boss is that the visual design is pretty neat. Not even so much the whole bodies grafted together thing, but the fact that one of the bodies on his left shoulder seems to actually perfectly mimic what the entire boss is doing. Whether it is controlling the being or just pretending, I don't know. But it's a pretty cool detail. Also, you can cut off his left arm, which drops a Faris Lockstone, and makes the fight a bit easier. Another pretty meh boss, without much interesting going for them. Let's move on. Wait, another pretty meh boss, without much interesting going for them? Didn't I just say that? So, this boss fight is just the same as Dragonrider, but there's another, weaker variant, on top of a pillar, that is shooting at you with a bow. It's largely down to RNG on when he decides to walk off, but once he does and approaches you at melee range, he is exactly the same as the first one. The added complexity of another enemy shooting at you every once in a while manages to scrape the fight into barely exciting territory. But because we've already fought this guy, I can't give this fight all that much points. On a good day, I would say this is how the fight was originally meant to be played, and the first Dragonrider encounter was retroactively put into the game earlier. Still, I slam rehashes a lot in these videos, so I gotta put them pretty low down. The visual design for this guy is so striking and sweet that I just had to mention it, because that's the first thing you will notice. The armor style looks out of place, and the material really looks like some kind of stained mirror. He's got a crown of thorns for some reason, and a mask imitating that of a human, instead of a traditional visor. His shield looks ornate and it's an actual mirror. The biggest thing about this fight is that his shield is actually always solid and completely blocks any attacks from you. I really like that the shield isn't just for decoration until he decides to block. You've always got to stay on the other side where it is, because your attacks will bounce off. When the knight attacks, he moves the mirror in a natural manner to also try to keep his balance, while fending off as many attacks as possible. His moveset overall is pretty diverse. The Looking Glass Knight looks really competent with a straight sword, and he's got slashes, thrusts, combos, etc. Furthermore, he's got some special moves evocative of the Xian warriors we've seen before. He will raise his sword up into the stormy sky to imbue it with lightning, then perform one of 3 different ranged or melee attacks, which look super sick and are satisfying to dodge. There is of course another gimmick. At about half health, the knight will put down his shield and entrench himself in this position. He will keep it steady, and then a spirit summon will break through the glass and into the arena to fight you simultaneously. This move will actually try to pull a player who has left a red summon sign before his arena into the fight. But if no players are available, it will default to an NPC character summon. This is a cool idea, but I don't feel like it adds fun to the fight. The knight alone is sufficiently fast and aggressive to be a challenging boss, so adding another character makes it a bit sloppy and almost unfair, since I personally find it really hard to find safe openings. But, while we're on this topic, I've got to rag on the Dark Souls PvP experience in general, because it's part of the fight now. I must say, 3 years ago, I thought that a netcode worse than that in the Ghost era Need for Speed games could not be made. And then I played Dark Souls. The netcode in the series is so bad that is the only reason why I do not engage in PvP in these games at all, if I can help it. The game is designed around precise timing of movement, dodges, parries, etc. So when you include a network delay of anywhere between a tenth of a second to 1 hour, the game just becomes an unplayable and buggy mess. I know that you can learn to game the netcode to your advantage, but at this point, you aren't playing Dark Souls, you are playing the netcode. But even if you do enjoy the PvP experience, the problem is that adding the element of a player to the fight means this enemy can have any character, and some of those builds are not going to make the battle more fun, but more unfair and unfun. Plus, when the online community of this game will be long dead, this boss will date significantly if you're doing a single player playthrough. There is a very fun boss in there, so I'm not going to dock too many points for the PvP, but I can't say nothing about it either. This might be the most hidden boss of the entire game, but it's also got to be one of my top picks, or maybe even favorite. The Darklurker requires encyclopedic knowledge of the game to find him, so I won't go over that now. Anyway, this guy has a very wide and diverse moveset, spanning both dark and fire damage. All of the attacks are uniquely and extremely well telegraphed. When he raises his finger into the air, that's a fast soul spear. A fire disc above his head means a volley of 3 fireballs. A lightsaber activating in his hand means a combo of up to 3 attacks. All of the attacks require you to move in different ways to avoid them. The fireballs mean you need to get a bit of distance and run sideways. The teleporting Dark Orb means you must keep track of the projectile's accelerating speed and position to predict where it will land. The laser attack means you must run behind him. All of those movements feel like they're setting up some kind of dance. They're pretty slow, but this isn't the end of the fight yet. When the Darklurker reaches about half health, he will duplicate himself, and now there are 2 of them to fight. During the duplication, you can actually sneak in some bonus damage by hitting both at once. And now the fight reaches new intensities. Most of the attacks are ranged, but all of them have such substantially different properties and tells, requiring you to constantly pay attention to both of the Darklurkers at once. Getting some distance to side-strafe a volley of fireballs while running behind the doppelganger can be demanding, but it is supremely satisfying. It's about as satisfying as Dark Souls bosses get, in my opinion. The only thing I would have maybe changed is for the 2 enemies to have separate health bars. As it stands, it doesn't matter who you're hitting, as both Darklurkers will die at once. Adding separate health pools would add some more depth, as you would be encouraged to wear down one at a time. But the fight is already complex and demanding enough, so I can see why the devs possibly deemed this to be too hard. Anyway, I love this fight, and I cannot say enough good things about it. They've somehow managed to create a boss that feels as dangerous to approach as Artorias, but with a polar opposite style of fight. This boss has a really cool visual design. It's this massive tadpole frog thing hiding this ugly dead face underneath. The outer shell is impervious to damage, and the monster will open up its face when attacking. Now, this fight is pretty boring. The monster can only really do some slaps and ranged attacks in its open form. They are pretty janky and not exciting to avoid. The boss is quite slow and not aggressive. It also suffers from the "if I just weren't doing anything, I wouldn't be able to lose" syndrome. The only cool move this enemy has is this really intimidating stand up and slam down attack. It's not terribly threatening though. The boss dies pretty fast. There's nothing else remarkable about this fight. This guy right here is the last champion guarding the resting place of King Vendrick, and he looks the part. This guy was once a paladin, but now he has become one with the Dark of the Undead Crypt. The presentation here is pretty stellar. Velstadt's gear looks like it belongs on a holy knight on a holy quest. His hammer is almost comically huge, and it rings when you're being pummeled with it. In the second phase, Velstadt uses hexes to help himself, and his animations and sound design really scream of a dark paladin. Mechanically, the fight is quite enjoyable. In phase 1, Velstadt has a range of melee options to bonk you with. His attacks are not very fast, but that's more due to the animations of the moves themselves, rather than the boss choosing not to attack. The chime hits really hard, and it can come from basically any side. The animations are smooth and the telegraphs are intuitive. In phase 2, he will cast a hex to buff himself. This will also unlock some new moves based on dark magic. The cast time is super long for how easy they are to avoid, so make sure to get in some damage. Overall, pretty enjoyable swordsman fight with character, but nothing too special. These guys are good to imagine as a rework of Ornstein and Smough, because there's a pretty similar dynamic going on here. The Watcher is faster and more nimble, and the Defender is more lumbering but tougher. Each of them also has a shield. This fight has less character than O and S, mostly because the differences between the two characters are not all that big. Getting close to both of them at once is suicide. Drag the faster one away from the slower one, be careful with your openings to attack, etc. Both movesets are pretty standard swordsman movesets, but the Watcher has a particularly nasty combo that will drain all your stamina to dodge every attack. Their swords are longer than they might seem, so watch out. When each enemy loses about half their health, they will buff their swords with lightning. It seems like they are programmed to go aggressive on the player when the other one is stuck doing this. The defender will actually put his shield away when this happens, and their moveset will change slightly. There is one more twist to this fight. When one enemy loses all their health, they don't die on the spot. Instead, they will become incapacitated, and if the other one stays alive for long enough, they will go in to revive their comrade with about half their health. It's a pretty unique twist that hasn't really been replicated since. It adds some depth and personality to what would be a flatly fine fight otherwise. I actually struggled significantly on them now. I'm not sure why, but I was just constantly underestimating their speed and aggression. I did learn a pretty important lesson for this fight though. When you're attacking the defender and the Watcher seems out of range to hit you, she isn't. But when you're attacking the Watcher and the defender seems out of range to hit you, he is. That's about all I can say about this fight. It's pretty exciting and the movesets are unique, but they aren't varied or novel enough to make a big impression on me. A filler boss to be sure. This dragon has all the identical moves of other red dragons we've been finding across Drangleic, but it can also fly up and around the huge cage, mostly to spew vague-looking fire AoEs. I don't really know how to describe the moveset, because if you fought the red dragon before Ornstein, you know what you're in for. He will mostly stomp around or do tail swipes. It can hover or fly around, clinging to the walls of the cage to spew fire, which looks really vague on where the damage boxes lie. None of these attacks are satisfying to dodge, the moveset is pretty simple, the fight is pretty static. Not much to say about this boss, just a boring interaction in general. Let's move on. Oh boy, if there ever was a boss that I dread fighting on an all bosses run. This dragon is an optional fight, but that doesn't excuse any of the bullshit. This might be the biggest dragon we slay in the series, but the battle just sucks. The dragon is really slow, and I mean really slow, on deciding what it wants to do. The fight just feels like I'm wailing on a static wall most of the time, but when the boss decides to do something, I almost wish I was back to hitting a dead wall instead. Probably the first move you will see is the foot stomp. I don't know why it's so slow. I don't know why it's so telegraphed. Maybe it is to compensate for the hitboxes the size of a football stadium. The other attack is to hover in the air and breathe down fire. What's unintuitive about this attack is that you must start running really early to avoid it. But you cannot just run in any direction. Running towards the dragon's tail gives you the best shot at living through it. If you get hit, you get knocked over. And this is a death sentence, because the fire lingers for so long that you get hit again and fucking die, because this attack deals about 5 trillion damage. It's got some other attacks, like a sideways jump, but all of those are really slow and boring. The fight becomes especially boring with how much health he has. This might be the highest health pool of the entire game. I'm just hitting a brick wall for minutes upon minutes, and the fight just lasts way too long. I think the biggest problem is a sort of exploit with the dragon's AI. If you stick to one foot, he will usually do one stomp and then switch to something else. But if you attack one foot, then after the stomp run to the other, he will be stuck alternating between the two stomps, giving you a free pass. This makes the fight really boring, but it's better than the frustrating slog it is otherwise. Really don't like this boss, and the game will be better off without it. Please don't make me go back to him to record more footage of other attacks. I fucking beg you. Speak of repeat bosses, Jesus Christ. Technically, it is a different boss than the last giant, but his moveset is basically the same. He's got a sword now, and a new move where he slams it down, and a ranged attack that comes out in a straight line. But this is really not consequential. The best thing about the fight is the presentation. It takes place during the battle between the giants and the kingdom of Drangleic. The arena is actually the same as that of the pursuers, but in the past. There are groups of giants fighting the royal soldiers, and warships out in the distance, firing those exploding projectiles upon the wall. We also get to learn how the statue heads blocking off the pursuers' arena ended up in the positions they did. The end. Nothing more to say. If you fought the last giant, you fought this guy. In fact, they are literally the same character, as indicated by some item descriptions. When first meeting Vendrick, you probably weren't doing enough damage to even start the fight. This is because he has extremely high defenses at this moment. You need to collect 5 souls of giants around the endgame, and each soul you collect doubles the damage you deal to him. Only once you have all 5 is the fight at all balanced. The fight is pretty bad. The king can only really do some basic sword attacks. He will usually just alternate between this overhead slam and this weird sideways slash combo. The second attack has a really weak telegraph, and the sword comes out with way more speed than it feels like it should. The animations for this boss are similarly unnatural and unpolished to that of the Rat Authority. This might be intentional, as Vendrick is as hollow as he can be. Still, the fight suffers for it. There really isn't all that much to say, other than this fight is boring and bland and it sucks. The default final boss of the game, Nashandra, is anticlimactically easy. I don't really hate her. I think she's designed fine as a boss. She's just way too slow and passive to make for an exciting fight. The biggest gimmick is that she will periodically summon 4 dark orbs around her, which will build up curse if you stand near. You can destroy each with 1 slap from any weapon. This adds some dynamic to the fight, but it's not interesting enough to be a big deal. It's also completely trivialized if you wear the Black Witch Veil, which makes you perfectly immune to curse. She's got some scythe attacks, which look pretty cool and are smooth to dodge. She has a straight laser beam from her hand, and an AoE. They're all serviceable attacks, but the pauses between them are just way too long to make it feel like a scrap for survival. The entire fight just feels really meh. I don't hate her as much as some people, but this is not an exciting fight by any stretch of the imagination. This boss didn't exist in the original release of the game. He was added later on as a secret true final boss. In order to make him appear, you must not only talk to him in all previous locations, but also kill Vendrick. Aldia will appear after you've killed Nashandra. If you've failed to meet the criteria once completing the game, you can only fight him by burning an ascetic, which will also respawn Nashandra. Pretty convoluted if you ask me. Anyway, this fight has so much more character than Nashandra. Aldia is this big head growing out of the earth. For most of the time, he will be covered in fire, which both deals damage to you if you're near, but also gives massive damage resistance from ranged spells and arrows. The fire disappears during many of his attacks, and also when he teleports around the arena. This gives a pretty organic feel to the battle, because that's how you're fighting many bosses anyway. Aldia just happens to be immobile for long periods of time, because he can't move on his own. He needs to teleport around. Usually, you would want to press on and attack after the boss has done a move, but this time the best windows are actually the wind-ups instead of the recoveries. The attacks are not all that fun or polished, there is a fair jank to them in my opinion. His main attack will be this homing ranged projectile of tree roots bursting from underground. This attack feels unnecessarily hard to predict to me, because instead of observing one projectile approaching you, you basically have to guess on when the next root will come out, and if it will even hit you. He's also got a sort of Fire Tempest style move where several roots will grow out in random locations, indicated by glowing spots on the ground. He can also summon 4 homing fireballs, which come out at inconsistent delays between each other. My favorite attack is where he charges up a massive fireball above his head. This lasts many seconds, and he is vulnerable during this time. When the charge up is done, he releases the nuke for massive damage if it hits. The fight doesn't feel all that polished, and it's not that challenging either. It manages to escape the "you'd be invincible if you weren't attacking" syndrome, because Aldia would die if you valued taking his life more than preserving your own. It would just take a long time. Anyway, I think this boss is better than Nashandra, and he's got some of my favorite dialogue in the series. However, he is not challenging or polished enough to be a real banger. There were 3 DLCs released for this game, and Crown of the Sunken King was the first one. This time, beating the base game doesn't lock us out of playing more of the current new game cycle, so I usually tackle the expansions after having done the base game. The new content really stretches my allegiance to not summon during the game. Each DLC has one area optional to beating the expansion, which was designed to be played in co-op. You can even summon players for it who don't own the DLC, or otherwise don't have access to it, which is a pretty cool concept if you ask me. However, the execution is less than stellar. The devs decided that just spamming a bunch of annoying grunts would make for an engaging experience. These areas are a slog to go through alone, and even with partners it's not a fun time. I'm not sure whether the bosses at the end were also supposed to be fought alone or with summons, but since players who don't own the DLC can still enter those battles, I decided to count them as part of the areas. Still, I was trying not to summon, and I didn't for any of the bosses, but I did summon for one specific part coming in later, which might have made this specific boss more frustrating than it needed to be. The boss is just 3 different human NPCs. One wields a great bow and thrusting sword, one is cosplaying Dwayne Johnson, and one is a big fan of Aava and wields dual katanas. Fighting human characters in the Dark Souls games is never all that exciting. A lot of them just feel pretty samey. For this fight, they didn't even bother to design a unique enemy as a boss. They just dressed up a few generic human characters and called it a day. The movesets are precisely what you would expect from player characters with the same gear. With how many enemies there are approaching you at once, it's quite imperative to run around the twists and bends of the arena to try and separate them even for a second, to give yourself an opening to strike. For some reason, there are a few petrification statues around the arena, and even one of those walking lizards with a cluster of them on its back. I don't know who thought this was a good idea. Anyway, the fight is pretty tedious and not all that memorable, but I did find it to be pretty exciting. 2 of the enemies were relentless in chasing me down, and the archer was pretty passive. This fight is pretty meh design-wise, but I can't say I was too frustrated or bored. I know many people consider this boss to be way too easy, but I actually really like her. The fight opens with just Elana using various halberd strikes and magic attacks. She's got some well telegraphed sweeping combos. Her magic consists of several spells. She can fire a volley of dark orbs, a shotgun blast of similar nature, summon homing dark orbs around her, or put down a fiery explosion with a delay where you're standing. This makes for a pretty competent boss fight alone, but there's a catch. She will occasionally summon help. Usually, she will just bring 3 skeletons. These are pretty easy to deal with, but they do add a distraction and the fight doesn't get all that overwhelming. The far more interesting alternative is that she summons fucking Velstadt. And I gotta say, the two movesets complement each other surprisingly well. Golden Boy's hammer strikes are slow enough to give you a comfortable window to hit Elana. He will relentlessly chase you around the arena, but Elana is pretty slow, so she will become separated. I gotta say, this combination works really smoothly and well. It feels almost as intentionally designed as Ornstein and Smo, even though Velstadt was clearly a boss made to be fought alone when the base game was being built. Unfortunately, Elana is quite easy if Golden Boy isn't summoned, which is down to RNG. I don't know what more I can say. Seriously, go and try this fight if you haven't already, because the words won't do justice on how polished it feels. I've gotta say, for some reason I vibe with this boss less and less as time goes on. The first thing that comes to mind is the presentation at the start. Shine is not a massive dragon, but as you enter the arena, he will wake up and sweep the air above him with green-tinged fire. At the same time, the music starts blaring for what is, in my opinion, a more epic entrance than Calamete's. Shine has some variety to his attacks. For the basic physical attacks, he can do a charge with a delayed head swipe. This will probably catch new players off guard, because they will expect to dodge the charge, but it's actually the head movement afterwards that is to fear. He also has some basic attacks with his small T-Rex arms. When it comes to fire, he can of course do his basic fire beam sweeps and turn his head around to hit players trying to poke his ass. Shine can also fly around for aerial strikes or to shoot some exploding fireballs, which leave clouds of toxins on the ground. These factors combined make for a fight that is slightly more complex than Calamite, but for some reason, the animations just kind of break the deal for me. I don't know what it is about them, but they just feel a little bit weird, which robs the fight of any emotional investment. The more I play this fight, the more unintuitive I find his melee animations, especially, and avoiding the exploding fireballs just feels like a crapshoot at this point. I don't really know if adding toxic buildup to all of his attacks really does anything to make the fight better. Toxic just feels like an unnecessarily powerful status effect for how much health it saps. But I guess the fight has this element where getting hit multiple times in succession is more punished than the same number of hits over a period of time. But you're trying to avoid hits all the time anyway. He also has a weird corrosive effect, where melee weapons will degrade a lot faster when hitting him. This effect is significant with how much health he has, so you will probably need to use at least one repair powder during the fight. Honestly, Calamite is also a boss that I find myself enjoying less over time. Therefore, it's really hard for me to put Shine in a good spot relative to him. Pretty enjoyable fight, but something about the animations just really does not jive with me. Let's now move on to the next DLC, Crown of the Iron King. What in the goddamn shit is this shameless rehash? I don't know what to say, man. It's the Smelter Demon again, but he's blue. The power-up to give him his fire aura is now an AoE explosion, and that's about the only difference. I've seen people say he has slightly different attack timings, but I do not see a difference. Fuck you, man. Let's leave this shithole. The big boy of this DLC. Another almost pure swordsman fight. I've gotta say, the moveset on this guy just slaps. He wields a massive beast of a greatsword in his left hand and a smaller straight sword in the other. The Fume Knight might not be as fast or aggressive as Artorias, but he makes up for it in sheer variety of attacks. some of his combos will really test your timing and stamina management. The basic combo he does with the straight sword almost feels like it's too fast for this game, but I wouldn't be playing Dark Souls if I wasn't up for an unnecessarily hard challenge. The amount of various swipes, slams, slashes, and combos that this guy can do with either sword is staggering. His combos are preset, but there are so many, and with such numerous combinations of the individual attacks, that you'd be forgiven for thinking he could chain them at will. In fact, that's exactly what I believed on my first time fighting this guy. Every attack must be dodged in precise windows and in precise directions. You need to know his moves in and out to beat this guy. He has a phase 2 where he will buff his left sword and put the right one away. This changes his moveset into just using the big one, on top of having increased damage. He also gets 2 new moves. One is a painfully slow sweep around him, which just feels like you've dodged a cataclysm if you did succeed. The other is an AoE explosion, which also sends out these orbs of fire spiraling around him outwards, which almost act like a secondary shockwave, since dodging them when up close is really hard. If you enter the arena wearing Velstadt's helm, he will actually go immediately into phase 2. I don't know whether this is because he hates Velstadt, or whether he actually loved him, so he gets mad at you for killing him. Either interpretation is really cool, and I'm torn on which one I accept. Anyway, another banging swordsman ending out the DLC fight. Really like this guy. What's this? Another banging swordsman in a DLC for a Dark Souls game? You can only fight Sir Alonne if you've already beaten the Fume Knight. However, the former is what gives you the crown for beating the DLC. So, technically, this is like a secret true final boss. Sir Alonne is meditating in this beautiful room with a view of a sunset, and the floor polished so well, it might just be brighter than my future. The presentation here is fantastic. Anyway, the boss itself is mechanically really sweet. I would say he's on par with Artorias in terms of speed and aggression. All of his attacks are telegraphed really well, and he likes to slide and jump around in physically inexplicable ways. The star of the show is this charge into slash attack. This move actually has variable timing on how fast he will move and swipe. This makes you pay extra close attention to what he's doing. He also has a pretty infamous grab attack, where he will stab you with his sword. If you mistime your dodge, the game will still let you complete the roll animation before teleporting you back onto his blade. This gives people false feedback on what is actually going on, because a common interpretation is that the hitbox for this attack is too wide. Anyway, this guy feels really similar to Artorias mechanically, in my opinion. The rest of his moveset is pretty nondescript, but it is fairly wide and will keep you on your toes. Makes me wonder why it took the devs the entirety of Dark Souls 2 and 2 whole expansions before we got a boss evocative of Artorias. This boss is accessible as soon as you enter the Crown of the Ivory King expansion. However, the beast will be invisible if you enter initially, making her utterly impossible to fight. You need to explore the zone in this area in order to find the Eye of the Priestess item, which will not only let you see Aava, but also the invisible human characters in the city, and it will even make the ghost enemies in the Shaded Woods completely opaque. So, the fight is not all that complex, but it is pretty fun. The tiger has some seriously delayed claw swipes, charging leaps, and some magical attacks too. She can summon a group of soul mass around her, and also produce a magical shockwave, as well as a Fire Tempest style danger zone. She is quite fast and aggressive, but not enough to make it feel overwhelming. The fight is fun to get good at, but by now it's gotten kind of boring to me. Don't get me wrong, it's polished and designed well, she just suffers from being a bit too easy to learn. The only real problem I have is that if you get hit by one of the soul masses, you'll get knocked over and take no damage from whatever is still hitting you. I'm not saying it would be fair to take 3 health bars worth of damage, but it also feels cheap to just avoid whatever is coming my way when I should be punished for getting hit. That's about all I can say. The boss is fun and well designed, but does not hold up all that fine once you've figured her out. I think it's mostly because the delayed arm swipes make her a bit of a one-trick tiger. Remember when I said this at the start of the previous video? Now I have something to say about every one of them, so I was inspired to make this video. That was technically a lie. When I was playing this DLC for the first time, I managed to reach the coffin to transport to the frigid outskirts, but somehow I didn't get close enough to it to spot that I could get inside. So I missed this zone. Once I was done with that character, I learned of the Ludenzalen boss fight and the area leading up to it. I then heard so much bad things about the frigid outskirts that I never really bothered to go the distance to fight them. I did enter the area to see what it was all about, but never all the way through. So, Ludenzalen were the only boss fight in the entire series that I have not done prior to starting work on these videos. And honestly, I wasn't missing much. The fight is largely a rehash of Aava. It starts off with one tiger, then when this enemy gets down to half health, another one will appear. Once you've killed either tiger, the other will buff up temporarily for increased damage and a slight health regeneration. Aava might have been a bit too passive for some tastes, but I do not see her warranting a duo boss fight. This battle is pretty lazy, and the enemies here were clearly not designed to be fought in a group. We've been over a fair few rehash and gank boss fights that you know how I feel about them by now, so to finish off, let's go out with a bang. This boss has got an entire expansion's worth of content leading up to him. You can go and enter the fight as soon as you beat Aava, but you will get swarmed by charred Lois Knights before you can even reach the Ivory King. What you must do is go into newly unlocked areas of Alone Lois and find 3 Lois Knights left behind. One more was already at the start, so that makes for 4 allies. As you go down the stairs, you get this awesome shot of your comrades in arms gearing up for battle, waiting for your word. You enter the fog gate to make a massive drop down through the ground and into the old chaos, which has been completely swallowed by magma. You land down with your squad, and then the fight begins. Charred Lois Knights will start emerging from 3 portals in the arena. As you kill them, your allies will start to sacrifice themselves, one by one, to close each portal. Every time they do, the amount of enemies in the arena decreases, but so does your backup. In the end, you will be left with 1 knight to help you when the boss comes in. Now, I must say, the charred knights are not that fun to fight personally. I think there were some common enemies in this expansion that were really polished and satisfying to battle, but those are not really among them. There's nothing all that wrong with their design, it's just that in a group, the fight gets kind of sloppy and unpredictable. Besides the enemies not being all that great, this sequence is genius. This is the first time in the series that we get some kind of non-phantom helper, and it's in this epic 5-on-4 all-out brawl taking place in one of the prettier arenas of the games. The fight is chaotic and exciting, and this makes up for the gameplay design being a bit weaker. The aggro from multiple enemies becomes manageable as their attention is divided among each of your allies. When this initial phase is over, the king himself will emerge from a dedicated portal. By this point, One friendly knight usually survives the onslaught to help me. I am a bit mixed on having this help, because once you freed all the knights, you don't have an option to fight without them, and the battle was clearly designed with them in mind. Still, having an additional entity to distract the boss feels a bit cheap. He dies fast anyway, so it's not a massive deal. The king himself is pretty fun to fight. I wouldn't say the design is all that stellar. He is about on par with Velstadt or something. He's got a small variety of sword attacks, most of which are sweeping slash combos. The attacks are not very fast, but their timings are pretty tricky. He never feels like he is letting off, it's more that the animations themselves are quite slow. About halfway through, he will buff his sword with magic, turning it into a lightsaber. This gives him more reach and an AoE style magical attack. I only have two small problems with this boss. The glowing sword looks longer than the sword actually has reach. In the footage, there was one moment where I thought for sure I was gonna die, but he didn't manage to hit me, despite me being halfway along the blue blade. The other problem is that fairly often, one of the friendly knights will not have sealed off one portal before the king arrives. Therefore, one more charred knight will spawn before the entrance is sealed. This is probably due to some coding jank, but it's not a huge deal. So, to summarize, this fight is a massive spectacle and an exciting sequence, but I don't think it is as polished mechanically as the GOATs. Class, what did we learn today? Rehash bosses and lazy ganks are bad? I'm joking, but I must say there are some real bangers in this game. I genuinely much prefer this game to Dark Souls 1, and I think the bosses are overall a step up. However, it's frustrating that it feels at times like we've learned nothing new, and for some reason it took us so long to get back up to form. The game had a troubled development, and it was made by a B team at From Software, so that explains most of it, but I am still a demanding consumer. Stuff like unnecessary ganks, janky telegraphs and animations, rehashes, all of this just makes me feel like we've not taken a step forward. However, there are so many boss fights in this game with some unique twists or personality that I can't help but love it. Anyway, thanks for the support on the previous video. These kinds of projects take a long time to make, and I've been working essentially every day since the release of the last one. I'll be seeing you later.